George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, had a fiery side, especially when it came to musicians he truly disliked. And his secret list of the top 6 is finally here. He might have seemed peaceful, but his thoughts on music were powerful. He had his own ideas about what was good, and he wasn't shy about it. When he heard sounds that bothered him, he let the world know exactly why. Let us now uncover the first artist who made George's no-play list and the jaw-dropping insult he threw their way. 1. Elton John. First up is Elton John, the famous singer and piano player. George Harrison might have thought Elton John was an okay person, but he definitely wasn't a fan of his music. It's good to remember, George was talking about the music, not always the person making it, though sometimes it was hard to separate the two. In 1976, George told a magazine called India Today exactly what he thought. "Well, Elton John's music is something I've never thought much of," he said plainly. "It all sounds the same, though I think he's written a good song once, many years ago." That was a pretty direct hit, but George didn't stop there. He explained why he felt that way. Of course, his music is made to a formula. Throw in lyrics, throw in 4 chords, shake well, and there it is, the new Elton John super hit. This was a harsh way of saying he thought Elton John's songs were predictable and made just to be popular, not from real artistic feeling. By this time, George was probably tired of being called the quiet Beatle. He wanted people to know he had opinions, and strong ones at that, and he had earned the right to speak his mind. He was the first Beatle to have a solo #1 song in both the UK and the USA with My Sweet Lord. His huge album, All Things Must Pass, showed everyone he was a great songwriter on his own, without needing John Lennon or Paul McCartney. He had proven his musical talent many times over. The timing of these comments about Elton John is also important. In 1976, George was very much into meditation and Indian music. He was searching for deeper meaning in life and in art. In the same interview, he said that most popular music in the 70s didn't really appeal to him. It didn't connect with what he was looking for. He preferred other artists. "There isn't too much going on that I seem to like," he admitted. Then he named some he did enjoy. "My favorites are Smokey Robinson and Stevie Wonder. Otherwise, George Benson, and of course, anything Dylan does is worth a listen." These artists were known for their soul, their unique styles, and their meaningful lyrics, qualities George felt were missing in Elton John's work. For George, Elton John's music felt too manufactured, too much like a product created for the charts rather than an expression of genuine emotion. As someone who was immersing himself in the spiritual depth and complex structures of Indian ragas, the catchy, radio-friendly tunes of Elton John likely seemed shallow. George was looking for music that touched the soul, that had layers of meaning. What he heard in Elton John's hits was, to him, a surface-level appeal. The quiet Beatle had a loud opinion on this one, making it clear that chart success didn't automatically earn his respect. If catchy pop formulas annoyed George, a different kind of sound from another famous musician also rubbed him the wrong way. 2. Neil Young. It might surprise some people, but George Harrison was not a fan of Neil Young's music. Neil Young is a very respected artist, loved by many for his honest songwriting and unique guitar playing. But George, who was clearly not afraid to go against popular opinion, had strong words for Young's guitar skills. We know this from a video taken in a recording studio in 1992. George was there to sing on a cover of his own song, "This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying," which Dave Stewart was recording. Bob Geldof, another musician, was also there. In a casual chat caught on camera, Geldof asked George if he'd heard Neil Young's album Arc, which was a collection of feedback and guitar noise. George's answer was quick and clear. "I'm not a Neil Young fan personally." He then went on to explain why, focusing on Young's guitar playing. "I just think his lead playing is just, I hated it, do you?" he asked Geldof. It was a strong word, hate. George continued, "Yeah, I can't stand it. I mean, it's that one string." This one string comment was a sharp criticism, suggesting he thought Young's guitar solos were too simple or repetitive. He added another layer to his thoughts. "I mean, it's good for a laugh, but the thing is, he's serious." This part is very telling. It seems George almost found Young's raw, minimalist guitar style to be a bit of a joke. But what really bothered him was that Neil Young seemed to be completely serious about it. It wasn't just an experiment, It was Young's actual artistic choice, and George just couldn't appreciate it. While many praised Young for his raw emotion and breaking away from typical guitar playing, George heard something he found unlistenable. This strong dislike probably came from George's own way of playing the guitar. George was known for his beautiful melodic solos and his skill with slide guitar. His playing was often described as tasteful and precise, making the guitar sound almost like a singing voice. He cared about the notes he chose and how they fit into the song. Neil Young's style was very different. It was often loud, distorted, and focused on feeling rather than perfect technique. Young might hit a wrong note or create a jarring sound if he felt it expressed the emotion he was going for. For George, who valued melody and careful craftsmanship in music, Young's approach was likely jarring. He probably looked for a certain kind of skill and beauty in guitar solos that he just didn't find in Young's playing. The fact that Young was serious about this style seemed to baffle George. It was so different from his own musical values that he couldn't connect with it. The Quiet Beatle had very clear ideas about good guitar playing, and for him, Neil Young didn't measure up. George had strong words for a guitar hero, but his criticism could also target a band's frontman if he felt they weren't up to par. 3. Liam Gallagher. Moving into the 1990s, a new wave of British rock bands became huge, and many were compared to the Beatles. Oasis was one of the biggest, with Liam Gallagher as their lead singer, known for his distinctive voice and confident attitude. George Harrison, now one of rock's respected older figures, wasn't very impressed with Liam. In a 1996 interview, George shared his thoughts on Liam, and they weren't kind. He suggested that Oasis might actually be a better band without him. "He's like a bit out of date, you know," George said. "I mean, he's a bit of a, it's just silly. He's silly." That was already quite a put-down, but George went on, sounding almost sorry for Liam, but still very critical. "I feel a bit sorry for him, really, because I think he's totally missed the bus. And I think it was proven when you see the band without him singing, you know, they're more in tune and they can, you know, I mean, he's just excess baggage, I think." Calling Liam excess baggage was a really strong insult. It meant George thought Liam didn't add anything important to the band musically and was actually holding them back. George also commented on Liam's public image. "And all he does is, make people think what a bunch of jerks they are." George seemed to find Liam's rock star antics and attitude to be childish and embarrassing. Liam Gallagher, who was famous for his own sharp tongue and not backing down from a fight, had a typically rude reply. When he heard what George said, Liam reportedly called George Harrison a nipple. He said, "The person thinking that is a nipple, and if you ever meet him, tell him. And if you're watching, nipple." It was a classic Liam Gallagher response. Short, insulting, and not very clever. Interestingly, despite this exchange, Liam didn't seem to hold a lifelong grudge. In 2013, Liam performed George's song, "My Sweet Lord," at a concert at the Royal Albert Hall. The performance was described as sounding like Liam Gallagher covering "My Sweet Lord," which probably means it had Liam's unique, somewhat raw vocal style. George's harsh view of Liam Gallagher likely came from a difference in what they valued in music and performance. George had been in the Beatles, a band full of talent where musical skill was key. He probably saw Liam's stage presence and attitude as more important to him than his actual musical contribution. George valued real talent and hard work, and he seemed to see Liam as mostly show and not enough substance. To George, Liam was perhaps a frontman who was more famous for his swagger than for his singing, and that didn't sit well with the former Beatle. George didn't just criticize newer artists. He also had strong opinions about bands from his own era, especially if they touched his own work. 4. The Hollies. Going back to the mid-1960s when Beatlemania was at its peak, George Harrison already had a sharp ear and wasn't afraid to criticize other musicians, even those from the same English music scene. The Hollies were another popular British band at the time. Both the Beatles and the Hollies were from the northwest of England, Liverpool and Manchester, respectively. But that didn't mean George would be friendly if he didn't like what they did musically. The trouble started in 1965. The Hollies recorded a cover version of a Beatles song written by George called "If I Needed Someone." To make things more interesting, the Hollies released their version on the very same day that the Beatles released their album Rubber Soul, which included George's original version of the song. This was a pretty bold move. George spoke to the NME, Nouveau Musical Express magazine in December of that year and made it very clear he was not happy. He called the Hollies cover rubbish. In England, calling something rubbish is a strong way of saying it's terrible. The provided text even says, "You can't get more savage than that." George explained more. "Their version is not my kind of music, they've spoiled it." He then criticized their general style. The Hollies are all right musically, but the way they do their records, they sound like session men who've just got together in a studio without ever seeing each other before. Technically good, yes, but that's all. Calling them session men was a big insult. It meant he thought they played the notes correctly, but without any real feeling, band chemistry, or new ideas. Things George valued highly, and which the Beatles were known for. He was saying their version was technically okay, but had no heart, unlike his original. These direct comments caused a bit of a stir, with some in the media calling it a small feud between the Beatles and the Hollies. A week later, Graham Nash from the Hollies responded, saying he was getting tired of everything the Beatles said being taken as gospel. The fact that both bands were from nearby cities with a friendly rivalry, Liverpool and Manchester, probably made the story even more interesting to the public. George's strong reaction was likely because he felt protective of his song. Songwriters often feel a deep connection to their work, and it can be upsetting to hear it changed, especially if they think it's been made worse. "If I Needed Someone" was an important song for George, as he was writing more and more for the Beatles. For him to hear another band cover it in a way he felt was lifeless, and then release it at the exact same time to compete with his own version, must have been very annoying. He felt they had missed the soul of his song. If a bland cover by a contemporary band upset George, an entire music movement built on attitude over skill was sure to get a strong reaction. 5. Pistols. In the mid-1970s, a new type of music called punk rock burst onto the scene. It was loud, angry, and very different from the polished rock music that had become popular. Punk bands often made fun of older, established bands like the Beatles. It was part of their image to reject the past. George Harrison, in return, had nothing good to say about the music of punk bands, especially famous ones like the Pistols. There's a little story about the Pistols and the Beatles. The Pistols' first bass player, Glenn Matlock, left the band in 1977. The band's manager, Malcolm McLaren, told the newspapers that Matlock was kicked out because he loved the Beatles too much. McLaren probably said this to make the Pistols seem even more rebellious and anti-establishment. The truth was likely more complicated, involving record deals and disagreements within the band. But George Harrison didn't seem bothered by this supposed insult. The main reason was simple. He really didn't like their music anyway. In 1979, he told Rolling Stone magazine what he thought of punk bands. "As far as musicianship goes, the punk bands were just rubbish. No finesse in the drumming, just a lot of noise and nothing." This fits with what we know George liked in music. He valued skill, melody, and careful arrangements. Punk, which often celebrated not being a skilled musician and creating raw, chaotic sounds, was the exact opposite of his taste. However, George did show some understanding of why punk music came about. He remembered seeing the Pistols on TV. One of them was talking about how young people felt they had no future except working in factories. George understood their anger and frustration. "Everybody wants everything, and nobody wants to do anything for it," he said, adding, "The only way you make more money is to work harder. But out of all that is born the punk thing, so it's understandable." But even though he understood their anger, George didn't agree with how punk expressed it. He said, "You don't fight negativity with negativity. You have to overpower hatred with love, not more hatred." This idea came from his spiritual beliefs. He thought punk's angry and destructive attitude was not helpful. The interviewer pointed out that this was maybe easy for an incredibly wealthy George Harrison to say, but it was what George truly believed. George disliked punk's noise and negativity. But perhaps his most complicated feelings were reserved for the music of someone he knew very, very well. 6. Paul McCartney. George Harrison's feelings about the music of his former Beatles bandmate, Paul McCartney, were probably the most complex. When the Beatles broke up in the late 1960s, there were a lot of hurt feelings and disagreements. George had often felt that Paul McCartney and John Lennon didn't take his songs seriously enough, preferring their own. These old tensions naturally affected how he saw Paul's music after the Beatles. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney had a very public musical feud, writing songs with digs at each other, George Harrison also had his opinions on Paul's solo work. In that same 1979 Rolling Stone interview, he was asked what he thought of Paul's music at the time. George described it as inoffensive. He then said, "All the noisy, beaty things I'm not into at all." But then that's not only with Paul's music, that goes right across the board. I'm not a fan of that sort of punky, heavy, tiny stuff. I like a nice melody. Inoffensive might sound polite, but from one musician to another, it could be seen as a criticism, meaning the music wasn't very exciting or memorable. His comment about not liking noisy, beaty things or punky, heavy, tiny stuff showed again that George preferred music with good tunes and careful construction, qualities he perhaps felt were sometimes missing in Paul's more upbeat rock songs. An even sharper comment came in an interview in the 1980s. George was asked about Paul McCartney's new recordings of old Beatles and Wings songs. Paul had re-recorded them for his 1984 movie and album, Give My Regards to Broad Street. George started off sounding mild. "I think they were okay. I didn't notice that they were new versions. I only watched it once. I quite liked it." He even mentioned a song he sort of remembered, Dancing, all that one about Bowen dancing and stuff, which was probably a confused reference to ballroom dancing. But then the interviewer told George that Paul had said he might re-record other old songs, maybe even some of John Lennon's, like Beautiful Boy or Imagine. The interviewer asked if this surprised George. George's reply was a real sting, aimed at why Paul might be redoing old songs. Paul, yeah, maybe because he ran out of good ones of his own. This was a very direct and quite mean suggestion that Paul McCartney was no longer writing good new songs and had to rely on his past hits. These comments, even if said casually, show the complicated relationship between George and Paul. George had worked hard to get his own songs heard in the Beatles. His solo success with All Things Must Pass proved how many great songs he had stored up. When he criticized Paul's music, whether calling it inoffensive or joking that Paul had run out of good new songs, it was partly George stating his own high standards for music. It also hinted at the old rivalries that never quite faded away after the Beatles ended. George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, truly had a unique voice and strong ideas about music. He wasn't just a bystander. He was a careful listener with a clear sense of what he liked and disliked. His words give us a peek into the mind of a great artist. What does his honesty tell you? Tell us what you think, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.